Lovely to see you all here. This is our session this evening on the so-called Messianic Secret in Mark's Gospel, which is illustrated with my challenging headline, "Don't Spread the Gospel." A number of you I know notice this and we've briefly mentioned it in a couple of places over the last 2 weeks, and I know it came to the fore for many of you when you were listening to Bishop Peter reading, because when you hear the gospel in its entirety in that short period, those consistent themes that you might write off when you hear just one little story on a Sunday morning become much more apparent when you hear them over and over again. And one of those is this thing called the Messianic Secret. And before I tell you exactly what it is, I need to tell you what came before it a little bit. So I'm hoping that you can imagine yourself as this attractive chap, a medieval monk, if you will. He is, yes, clear out the breeze, very wise. He is engaging in some monkish activities, doing some copying of the Holy Scriptures. And he represents the theologians for the church from the time of the church fathers up until the Enlightenment to the Protestant Reformations. It was a very different time to study Scripture. Firstly, it was very difficult to get your hands on it at all. Secondly, you had to be able to read, which wasn't awfully easy. And you had to be able to read whichever language the translation that you happened to be able to get hold of was written in, which was quite likely not your mother tongue. It wasn't very easy to cross-reference documents, because there was no Control-F find function. If you wanted to know how many times one of the gospel writers used a certain word in their gospels, you kind of literally had to go through and pick, here he uses it once and twice, and keep a tally somewhere. Writing materials were expensive, and books were hard to come by. It was difficult to share knowledge with other intellectuals. And so the limit of the kind of engagement that you're going to be doing as a theologian is, you look in one gospel and you see, the 12 names of the disciples in this gospel are 1 to 12. And you look in another gospel and you see, the 12 names are 1 to 12, and there's one or two of them that are slightly different. And you think, well, in that case, maybe one of them had two names, and by a kind of process of elimination, we can assume that this person was also called whatever. You engage in a kind of biblical scholarship that attempts to conflate all four gospel traditions and the rest of the biblical scriptures and make them all sit comfortably with one another. So your main emphasis is finding passages that are difficult to understand or appear contradictory, and then working out why that's not true, working out how it fits in with the whole scheme. And that's the kind of thing we looked at Pious 2 weeks ago, and he's our earliest source on who might have written Mark, and that's the kind of thing that he explains in this quotation, which I've chopped down a bit from the first time we saw it. The elder used to say, Mark, in his capacity as Peter's interpreter, wrote down accurately as many things as he recalled from memory, though not in an ordered form. So he's been reading the Gospel of Mark, and he's realised there's this problem that the order of events doesn't always match up neatly with the order of events in other Gospels. And he's thinking, well, how on earth am I going to reconcile that with a true historical portrait of Jesus' life? And his answer is, well, he's remembering these things from memory, and what he's doing is he's making sure he's truthfully and honestly writing down stories, but he doesn't care about chronological order. That's just not something he cares about. So he's going through this sort of biblical engagement of reconciliation. How do we make these two things fit together even though they don't seem to work very smoothly? Enter the 18th century and the first real kind of critical biblical engagement. And the first type that we have is known as source criticism. So this is the idea that if you can pick out of texts, or if you can work out for a whole text where it comes from, you can get a better idea of which parts in it are historical, which parts in it are later additions, and why they're ordered in the way that they're ordered. And this is the picture that I talked about when we were discussing where Mark's Gospel came in the order of which order the Gospels were written. And this is the generally assumed by 85-90% of scholars with complex additions pattern. So we've got Mark as a kind of primary Gospel used by Matthew and Luke, and we've got Q, which is the German word for source. Nominate Kevin for pronunciation. Exactly. And that's where we have the sayings of Jesus, his moral teaching, lots of his parables, that kind of thing. And Q feeds into both Matthew and Luke. Mark feeds into both Matthew and Luke. And source criticism was reaching its pinnacle in the mid-19th century, towards the end of the 19th century. And they felt really contented. One of the things that, when you start doing critical engagement, one of the things that you obviously start worrying about is, well, how do I know that the things I'm reading about this person are historically accurate? If I'm starting to question where they're coming from and why they're being written there, how can I be certain of the accuracy of them? And if I can't be certain of the accuracy, how can I be certain of the truth claims, the doctrinal claims about Jesus? And so there was, and there has continued to be throughout history, this idea of a search for the historical Jesus, a search for the facts that we can know absolutely about the person, the man, Jesus Christ. And they were quite pleased when they got to this model, and they'd gone through a lot of really excellent arguments and primary source work, looking at where the stories came from. They were very pleased when they got here because they thought Mark gives us a sort of unadulterated, step-by-step story of the things that Jesus did. And you hear that when you read Mark's Gospel. It's Jesus went and he did that, Jesus went and he did this, he came to this town, he preached, sick people came to him, he healed them, and then he went to this town and he preached and sick people came to him and he healed them, and then he went to this town and he drove out some demons, and then he went here. Half of Mark's sentences start with the word and the other half more or less start with the word immediately. So it's just this series of kind of what I did over my summer holidays. You know, when kids write, and then we did this, and then we did this, and then we did this. So they were very pleased that they found Mark, which for most of history, as I said at the first week, most of history was thought of as a later gospel, that Matthew's gospel had just been shredded down to form Mark's. They were very pleased when they realized actually Mark was really early, because of course the earlier it is, the more reliable it is. So they were happy with Mark being a kind of history of what Jesus did. And then they were happy with this Q source. We haven't actually got a document that is the Q source, but we kind of hypothesize it by taking out those bits of Matthew's Gospel and Luke's Gospel that match one another that don't come from Mark. We assume that they must have shared a common source in order to have the same, because we're pretty sure they didn't see one another's Gospels, so they must have shared a common source. So closely matched are their passages of Jesus' moral teaching. And so they were quite pleased because they had Mark being the day-to-day life of Jesus and this Q source that they sucked out of Matthew and Luke's Gospel as being an early source that attested to the sayings, the moral teachings of Jesus. So they felt fairly confident in their historical knowledge of Jesus' goings about and the words that he was saying. That required a certain belief about Mark's Gospel and a belief in its naivety. That Mark literally did just make a list of things that Jesus was up to, that he had in himself no editorial input, that he was just an objective recorder of history. And there were some things that suggested that was true, like the simplicity of his writing. But at the turn of the 20th century, that all got blown up into the air. This is my picture, which is meant to represent. Can anyone guess? It's a clever joke. So I'm looking at you, Ian. This is form criticism. His form is very bad. If you're ever deadlifting, don't deadlift like that because he's about to blow out a couple of discs. So this is form criticism. It's got nothing to do with how you lift weights. What it's got to do with is the way in which the people who put the text together had purposes in mind, their editorial initiative. And the first chap to come up with this was a German, all good theology done in the 19th and 20th century was done in Germany, and you had to read German in order to engage with any of it. So the book that Reid wrote about the Messianic Secret, when we get to it, he wrote it in 1901. It was translated into English in 1971. So if you were only reading theology in English, you were 70 years behind the curve. So Hermann Gunkel came up with this idea of form criticism. And we learnt two words the first week. One was the word for short standalone stories within the gospel. Anyone got that one? Beginning with P. They're called pericope, or short standalone stories. And the other one was a word beginning with K that was about
Preaching.
which was about preaching, yeah. The preaching of the early church, which was kerygma. And the idea is that that's the kind of the kernel of truth at the heart of the preaching of the early church, kerygma. And our word or our phrase to learn today, given that you were so good at remembering the last two, is sitz im Leben, which is this idea of setting in life that or you probably don't say it at all like that. How do you really say it? Sitz im Leben, okay. And the idea is that reading the Gospels tells you something about the community that the author came from, was writing for. That there is editorial influence, that they're doing things deliberately in order to mould the story to their community, to their audience, and we can work out something about their character and their intention of their authorship. So this chap called William Reid, or William Reid, or something like that, being German as he was, he came up with this idea that within Mark's Gospel there is a Messianic secret. Most of the form criticism was actually taking place on the Old Testament. So the book of Genesis is a wonderful storehouse of engaging with this kind of material. Do you remember at the very start of the Genesis account there's two different creation narratives? And that was what really sparked off a lot of the biblical criticism, because someone thought, if there's two creation narratives, maybe there are two different authors. And they went through, and very pleasingly, those two authors nearly always use their own name for God. One of them calls God Elohim, one of them calls God Yahweh, and you can quite happily kind of divvy up portions of the Genesis account, one to one author and one to another, and then see how it was edited later and redacted together. So most people were doing work on the Old Testament, but Reid decided he'd do some work on the New Testament. He came to the Gospel of Mark, and he heard, or he found when he was reading through, these persistent messages about secrecy. And there are an awful lot of them. And he kind of noted them all down, and then he made an argument about what they mean. So we'll go through what some of them are. This first one, this is Jesus expelling demons, exorcising. And when he does it, he commands the demons nearly every single time to not tell everybody else who he is. So the demons always seem to know that he's the Son of God. They always address him as Son of God. And the idea of titles becomes quite important in this. the way in which Mark uses the titles Son of God, or Son of Man, or Messiah. And it looks like, it seems probably quite clear to us that you're not going to remember 40 years later precisely which of those three designators the person in your story used. So when you choose to use one of them, the likelihood is that you're choosing to use it because it fits either your unconscious idea of what that person would have said, or it fits some conscious and deliberate stream motif that you're trying to put through your writing. So, Son of God, it comes right at the start of Mark's Gospel. We're told as the readers, this is the Gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. And then it comes on the lips of demons, never on the lips of humans. So the demons all seem to recognize Jesus as the Son of God. And also Son of God comes on the Transfiguration and at the baptism when the Father's voice kind of booms down out of the clouds, "This is my Son, the beloved, in whom I'm well pleased." So it's only supernatural demons and God who use this term Son of God to refer to Jesus. And when they do, Jesus says to them things like, in Mark chapter 1, we read, "He cured many who were sick with various diseases. He cast out many demons. He would not permit the demons to speak because they knew him." And then again in Mark 3, "Whenever the unclean spirits saw him, they fell down before him and shouted, 'You are the Son of God.' But he sternly ordered them not to make him known." So demons is one place where they're all told to be silent. This is an image that represents a lame man being lowered through the roof of a house. Healings are the second place. When people are healed, Jesus tells them not to let everybody know about their healing. So in chapter 1 again, Jesus heals this man, sends him away, and says to him, "See that you say nothing to anyone, but go show yourself to the priest and offer for your cleansing what Moses commanded as a testimony to them." But he went out and began to proclaim it freely and to spread the word. So they don't always follow what Jesus tells them to do, which is another interesting thing, because it seems quite embarrassing. It seems like not the sort of thing you'd want to put down if you were claiming that someone was the Messiah, the great leader of your people, that they were so flagrantly disobeyed right at the beginning of their ministry. Perhaps the most pressing example about the healing miracles is this one, the raising of the dead girl. So Jesus comes along and he says, "Oh, don't worry, she's not really dead." And everybody laughs at him. And then he put them all outside, and he took the child's father and mother and those who were with him and went in to where the child was. He took her by the hand and said to her, "Talitha cum," which means, "Little girl, get up." And immediately the girl got up and began to walk about. She was 12 years of age. At this, they were overcome with amazement, appropriately. He strictly ordered them that no one should know this. You've got all these wailers and people outside, and the whole kind of community devastated at the death of this 12-year-old girl. Jesus raises her from the dead and then tells her and her family and the couple of disciples that are there with him, no one is to know about this. That's so kind of historically absurd that he might have made this claim, that it looks almost certainly like this is something which Mark has inserted for some purpose of his own. Reid doesn't stop there. He talks also about Jesus and the disciples engaging in secret, in private. Most clearly in Mark's Gospel, this comes with the 3 times that Jesus takes the disciples aside and foretells his own death on the cross. And the disciples are painted as being these idiots, and they don't understand, and Peter gets very defensive, he says, "No, this can't possibly happen to you." But there are more than that. There's Jesus taking his disciples aside after he's spoken a parable. And we read in chapter 4, with many such parables he spoke to them, that is, the crowds, as they were able to hear it. He did not speak to them except in parables, but he explained everything in private to his disciples. So again, there's this idea that to the crowds, he only offers these stories without explanation, and it's only in the secret enclave of his close disciples that he offers more than that. Oh, here's another very clever little pun. Silence of the Lamb? Yeah? Hey? That's a good one. So he also commands his disciples not to tell anybody anything when they realize who he is. So, most famously, Jesus is talking to his disciples. He says, "Who do you say that I am?" He's asked them, who does everybody say that I am? And they say, well, some say Elijah, and some say a prophet, and some say... And he says, but who do you say that I am? And Peter answers him, you are the Messiah. He still doesn't use that term, you are the Son of God. He says, you are the Messiah. And Jesus sternly ordered them not to tell anyone about him. So even when the disciples, who've been quite stupid the whole way through, even when they finally cotton on, he still says, don't tell anyone about me. And the same on the Mount of Transfiguration. Then a cloud overshadowed them, and from the cloud there came a voice, this is my son, the beloved, listen to him. Suddenly when they looked around, they saw no one with them anymore, but only Jesus. As they were coming down the mountain, he ordered them to tell no one about what they had seen, until after the Son of Man had risen from the dead. So he tells his disciples to be silent about what they do know when they finally catch on. And finally, the obscurity of parables. We read this particularly confusing verse in Mark's Gospel in chapter 4. Mark doesn't really go in for parables at all. That's one of the things that a lot of people realised was enormously lacking when Bishop Peter read to us. A lot of that... a lot of the moral teaching and a lot of the parables that we're so used to hearing in the Gospels are more or less completely lacking from Mark's Gospels. He really doesn't like parables terribly much, or at least he doesn't think that they're worth relating to us. But we do read this concerning parables. When he was alone, those who were around him, along with the 12, asked him about the parables, and he said to them, to you has been given the secret of the kingdom of God, but for those outside, everything comes in parables, in order that they may indeed look, but not perceive, and may indeed listen, but not understand, so that they may not turn again and be forgiven. Which sounds like really harsh and confusing words, and not at all like the sort of thing that the Jesus that we see painted in the rest of the Gospel ought to be saying. It feels really out of place. So these were the 5 things that Reid identified, that Jesus commands demons to be silent when they know who he is, that after the healing miracles, he demands that those people who've been healed are silent, and particularly the absurdity of demanding that a girl raised from the dead not tell anyone about the fact that that happened. He teaches his disciples in private, in secret, when he's not teaching the crowds. He commands his disciples to be silent when they do finally realize who he is. And this strange passage about parables, that the purpose of them is to obscure, to make it more difficult to understand who he is, even to the extent that you thereby cannot receive forgiveness. So Reid highlighted all of these, and they were known about before. It wasn't that no one had ever realised that Jesus kept telling people not to talk about who he was. They had been known about before, but they'd been engaged with in that theological method that I was talking about, in which you attempt to make everything make sense. And so the explanations given were normally things like, well, if Jesus had been openly known as the Messiah, then the political forces at the time would have come to capture him more quickly. He wouldn't have had time to do the ministry he wanted to do, to say the things he wanted to say. He would have been crucified before he was ready, something like that. Or if everybody had known he was the Messiah and he could do these amazing healing miracles, they would have so flooded down to him that he would barely have been able to move. He would have spent his whole time just healing people who were sick and ill, and he'd never have had the opportunity to move freely about the country like he did and engage all these different. So those are the kind of historical options that were preferred before Reid got to his thesis. Reid's thesis is completely radical in comparison. He says that Mark invented the notion of secrecy to reduce a tension that existed in the early Christian community about beliefs surrounding Jesus' identity as Messiah, as Son of God. So what Reid is arguing is that Jesus never claimed to be the Messiah. And indeed, if you read through the Synoptic Gospels, there are very few places, unlike John, where Jesus comes in being, I'm super Messiah from day one. In the Synoptic Gospels, very rarely does Jesus make any direct claims like that. There's that one moment before the Sanhedrin, the Jewish council, where they ask him if he's the Messiah, and he decides not to answer. And then they ask him again, and he finally says, I am, and you will see the Son of Man coming in his glory, on and on and on. But there's just that one moment. So what Reid said was, actually, historically, let's believe that Jesus didn't make any claims that he was the Messiah. And the reason that Mark has this secrecy motif is so that the early Christians who knew that Jesus hadn't made these claims could understand why he could still be the Messiah. So, of course, you didn't hear Jesus make these claims because he always said to anyone who heard, don't tell anyone, keep it secret, you mustn't tell anyone. And that's why you never heard Jesus actually saying he was the Messiah, but he was the Messiah. He knew he was the Messiah. A few special people around him knew. Supernatural powers, they definitely knew. But he made sure that everybody else didn't know. And it's only, Reid claims, when the early church has come kind of independently to this belief in Jesus' messiahship because of the experience of the resurrection, that they then invent this secrecy motif to ease that tension of thinking, well, if he really is the Messiah, why did he never tell anyone? Did he not know himself? Was God without the knowledge of his own godhood? Jesus' very nature is at stake for Reid, and that put him in the firing line immediately for a lot of critical engagement. It wasn't his theory. He published in 1901. It wasn't really until 1920 that people really grasped it. Here he is. This is our friend Reid. It wasn't until 1920 that people really got on board with it. And then from 1920 onwards, it began to kind of slump and decline a bit, really. That thing about titles came important for Reid as well. He said that the point of the Messianic Secret is that you can only understand Jesus as Messiah when you engage with the cross. So in the same way that the early Christians didn't experience Jesus as Messiah during their engagement with him in his lifetime, and it was only afterwards they engaged with him as Messiah, so too that's what Mark's trying to reflect in the way that he writes. So no human ever talks about Jesus as Son of God until the moment that the centurion is looking up at the dead body of Jesus on the cross, and he says, surely this man was the Son of God. That's the first time it's engaged with and admitted. the secrecy motif appears most strongly in Mark. It pops up in the other two synoptic gospels, probably as a remnant of its appearance in Mark and their use of Markan material. It's certainly not nearly as thorough. And interestingly, it pops up in John, even though John has this very high Christology. From the very beginning, Jesus knows that he's God, that he's the Messiah, and exactly what he's doing and fulfilling. But still, Jesus in John's Gospel every now and then says to people that they're to keep things secret. And Reid thought that added even more evidence behind his claim, because if John and Mark, these two independent Gospels, both testified to this same secrecy motif, then there must have been an independent source even earlier than them in which secrets abounded. He was immediately attacked. At the time, it was a man called William Sanday. He was an Oxford professor, and he wrote the following words: "A 20th century forger or criminal of the type dealt with by Sherlock Holmes might conceivably cover up his tracks in the way Reid supposes. But that any first century community or writer should act so is incredible." And that's the basis of the reason for not believing that Reid is right. This idea of you're reading way too much into that. And that's been the criticism the whole way through. His theory requires that Mark is a quite astonishing literary genius, basically. There's some credence for that idea, and we'll hear a bit more about that probably next week. The end of Mark's Gospel, I've talked about it as a cliffhanger before, and the fact that it's the very first cliffhanger in history. The Gospel is maybe a genre that we've never seen before. If Mark is inventive enough to create a new genre of writing, to offer a new way of ending a text, is he creative enough to come up with a systematic way of reducing tension through a narrative for his community? It's possible, but it puts an awful lot of emphasis on someone who was a pretty bad writer. Now, I'm pretty terrible at spelling, and I hope that doesn't cross over into being pretty terrible at everything else. Mark was pretty terrible at spelling and pretty terrible at grammar. Maybe it tells us something, maybe it doesn't. Today, Reid's idea, because of the compelling nature of the amount of evidence, those 5 points that I listed at the start, it continues to be discussed, and people continue to be interested in it. There are some elements, like Jesus' teaching the disciples in private, that now we mostly dismiss as being irrelevant to the secrecy motif. They don't really fit that same mold of people recognizing him as the Messiah and then saying, you can't tell anybody. He takes his disciples aside and he teaches them in private. That's not even to do with his messiahship. What is the relevance of that to add weight to Reid's argument? N.T. Wright, this man here, whom some of you will recognize and whom some of you have read, I suspect, he is probably the modern day Sanday, if you will. He's the chief antagonist to Reid. And his argument is still very similar. He says the following things. He says that such creativity by the early Christian community, or it's possible that it's an editor of Mark's Gospel, is inconceivable given the short period of time following Jesus' death in which the Gospel was written. So to come up with such a complex ploy in the 35, 40 years you've got from Jesus' death until the publishing of the Gospel is inconceivable, he thinks. He goes on to say that the theme itself is not consistently employed throughout the Gospel. And here really is one of the kicks in the teeth. If you're the editor in charge and you're deliberately setting up this theme, then you don't leave any material that stands in direct opposition. And do you remember Legion, the demoniac who's got thousands of demons, and then he begs for them to be sent into the swineherd, and they run down the hill into the water? So after he's been healed, the man who had been possessed with demons begged Jesus that he might be with him. But Jesus refused and said to him, "Go home to your friends and tell them how much the Lord has done for you and what mercy he has shown you." And he went away and began to proclaim in the Decapolis how much Jesus had done for him, and everyone was amazed. That's not the kind of story you deliberately include when your whole point is that Jesus was engaging in a model of secrecy. N.T. Wright thinks further that the resurrection on its own was not sufficient that people would then think back on him and think, oh, that must be the Messiah. They didn't think that the girl who was resurrected from the dead was the Messiah. If Jesus never said he was a Messiah in the first place, why is the resurrection of him as opposed to the resurrection of anyone else? And there are quite a few resurrection stories in the Gospels and floating around in the area at the time. Why is that sufficient evidence to think that this person is the Messiah compared to all those other people who have been resurrected who you don't think are the Messiah if he never claimed it himself? You also have to believe that the earliest Christians, if it comes from an early tradition, or that the author of Mark's Gospel added these unsubstantiated, cumbersome statements to the lips of Jesus. I've said before that what we think of now as kind of scholarly good practice about not copying other people's sources, citing references, was largely ignored in the first century. So maybe it wouldn't have been, and it wasn't unusual at all to attribute works and books to famous and important characters in your community, despite the fact they didn't write them. And that there wasn't anything wrong with that. That wasn't a bad thing to do. That was just standard practice. So would the early church have done that? It comes back again to that idea of which one is more believable. Do I want to believe that that's what the church did, or do I think that's so far-fetched as to be implausible? Then there's a question of why Jesus was crucified if he didn't claim to be the Messiah. What so angered the Jewish authorities that they pulled him up in front of the tribunal, that they got the Romans' authority to crucify him, if all he was doing was being a moral teacher, going around exorcising demons and healing people? That's not the sort of thing that incites the hatred of authorities. What incites the hatred of authorities is claiming to be standing above and beyond them, being political, endangering social fabric. Healing people is not dangerous in that way. So if Jesus never makes these public claims to be Messiah, you have to invent another reason that they crucify him. What so upset them about Jesus that they crucified him? And finally, Wright reckons that, applying the very dubious Occam's razor theory, that if we have to accept all of his objections above in order to accept Reid, and we've got a better alternative that requires us to be less imaginative, we should probably be less imaginative. Wright goes back to those kind of early historical claims to say that Mark is just writing the absolute sort of objective canonical history, and the reason that Jesus is doing this is because he wants freedom to move about, he doesn't want to be noticed, he's acting in humility. They sound to me to be rather naive, I think. The amount of evidence that Reid presents, the overwhelming sense, especially when you hear the gospel all at once, that people are being told to be secret again and again and again, seems to me above and beyond just Jesus wanting to avoid the ire of the authorities too early. I'm not sure the Jesus character that I know backs down from that kind of fight very often anyway. It doesn't seem to ring true with the sharp-witted and biting answers that he gives to the scribes and the Pharisees, embarrassing them in front of all of their intellectual mates. There are some people today, one example is Burton Mack, he's an American theologian, who want to more or less keep Reid completely intact. He wants to carry on with this idea that Jesus makes no claims about his messiahship. And the way he understands it is that he wants to avoid Mark having to be a complete literary genius, because that's a step too far for him. And so he thinks that what he does is he uses literary tropes, so the kind of the memes of the day, I suppose, the consistent themes, narratives, myths, stories that exist within ancient Greek literature. And he weaves them into his story so that he's not having to come up with this idea of a kind of secretive hero, but that he's borrowing the secretive hero motif from all those other ancient Greek stories that have an idea of a secretive hero. And he most clearly identifies Odysseus. And that's who this chap here is meant to be, with his harpies. Are they harpies? No, they're sirens. Sirens. They look more like harpies to me. It says sirens, yeah, but my sirens don't have wings. Yeah. But they swim, don't they? They like sit on rocks and swim. Aren't they more like evil mermaid sirens? Maybe I need to go back to my Greek myths. Anyway, so he identifies Odysseus, and Odysseus on his return home disguises his identity in order to avoid his enemies. And so Burton Mack suggests that maybe it's not that Mark is this literary genius, but instead he's just borrowing from stories and ideas that he'd already know from things like the Odyssey and the stories told around campfires. And there's a vein that runs through them that Mark would be familiar with, of the hero disguising his identity to serve some purpose. So Mark is borrowing someone else's idea. It still requires him to kind of very intelligently weave that idea. Even if he doesn't come up with the idea of secrecy, he still needs to weave it very carefully through all of his stories in order to get the gospel that we read today. I don't think terribly much of him either. For my money, and how I enjoy paying my taxes. For my money, you have to engage with the fact that there is this overwhelming theme throughout Mark's Gospel that in places, particularly the resurrection of the dead girl, seems so completely absurd as to be beyond historical, and Mark, I wish to give Mark the credit that this is a purposeful intention of his. I don't agree with Reid that the intention is to ease the tension that the early church felt in Jesus never claiming messiahship, but they want to claim him as a Messiah, and so they make up this story that, oh, he did claim he was a Messiah, but only ever in secret. I'm not sure about that bit. After all, he was put to death for being an enemy of the state. He makes the messianic claim to the Jewish council. We as the readers are told at the very beginning, this is the Son of God. We're always meant to know so that we can observe the stupidity of the people in the story not realizing what to us is obvious. We're told again at the end by the centurion looking at the cross. For me, it's all about the cross. That second point that Reid makes to back up his idea, I think, is really the primary purpose. That messiahship only exists in relation to death and to resurrection. That what Messiahship is about is the way of the cross. And that's a for us maybe familiar idea. It's a very strange idea in a Greek literary world where heroes in Greek literature engage in sacrifice, but if you're a hero who does a sacrifice in Greek literature, that means you send 5,000 of your best men to their deaths in order to win the battle for yourself. There's no concept of engaging in self-sacrifice. Sacrifice is always about sacrificing something else that you value in order for your own gain. It would be absurd. It's as Paul. We heard it on Sunday, didn't we? In the reading from Paul's epistle, that it's a stumbling block to the Gentiles and foolishness, stumbling block to the Jews and foolishness to the Gentiles. But we proclaim Christ crucified. And for me, that's what this consistent secrecy is all about. The first time that Jesus says, "Yes, I am the Messiah," is the same moment where he assures his own destruction. He's standing in front of the Jewish council and they ask him for the second time, "Are you the Messiah?" And he says, "I am." And that's the first time he claims for himself Messiahship, and it's the moment that there's no turning back. And the centurion makes that amazing claim, looking up at the cross, the first time any member of humanity has realized who this man is he's here, dead on the cross, a wrecked body, and he recognizes him as the Son of God. So I don't want to push Messianic Secret aside. I think that there's too much evidence to say it's nothing at all. But for me, it's all about understanding Messiahship exclusively in terms of the way of the cross, the path of the cross. It might be artificial. It might be a Markan invention. He might just be using historical stories in a clever and intentional way to bring that out. But his purpose in doing it is to expose a very historical, true claim about Christ's Messiahship, about his lordship, and about the necessity of death in order to be a Messiah. That's me. No plants this evening. And I forgot to stop halfway through and ask people what they were thinking. But please do spit it out now.
Jonathan, is there Messiah would have been a problem for the Sanhedrin, for the Jewish leaders. Son of God would have been a problem for the Romans. Is there any kind of purchase in distinguishing between those two titles? If Mark's Gospel is one that is written, as we think, for the Roman Latin Christians, the revelation that he's Son of God is the big one.
Yep.
The revelation he's Messiah doesn't make any sense, because they don't have that in their vocabulary.
Yeah, there's an enormous amount of research. It's become, 100 years ago it was incredibly popular. It's still incredibly popular. Not just analysing where and how these titles are used by the authors of the Gospels, but also what on earth they might mean to the people who are hearing them. So, Son of God immediately for us makes us think of a deity, someone who is divine. But it's not totally clear that the people... So there are plenty of attested circumstances in which the title Son of God applies to humans, in as much as we now think of, I suppose, we think of ourselves sometimes as being kind of fellow heirs with Christ. Now that wasn't the way in which they were using it, but sons and daughters of God. We're all sons and daughters of God. I'm a son of God, you're a daughter of God. It's no claim about our divinity, but it's a claim about our relationship to the divine. It's not a subject that I know enough about to give you an up-to-date. I haven't read anything on titles for 6 or 7 years, anything kind of substantive. So, but yeah, it's definitely a very open and engaging question about what they might mean. Yeah. No.
I very strongly take your point that Messiahship is revealed in the crucifixion and suffering of the Messiah. Is that?
Yeah, no, you're probably right that actually I should have been more accurate in the words that I used at the end. So Messiahship is revealed. Messiahship, in as much as the word Messiah, is revealed more gradually throughout Mark's Gospel. Yes. That Peter says, "You are the Messiah." That before his crucifixion, in front of the council, they say, "Are you the Messiah?"
Yes.
And he says, "Yes." Son of God is the bracket of the whole piece. We're told at the start, the Son of God. Throughout the whole story, it's only the voice of God the Father and the demons use Son of God, and then it concludes Mark's Gospel more or less. Because remember, there's not 3 chapters of resurrection stories at the end. So the cross is basically the end. It concludes Mark's Gospel with the dead Christ and the centurion say this is the Son of God. So yeah, that one is much more. That much more pleasingly adheres strictly to a nice pattern. The use of the word Messiah, which is, as you said, the Jewish word that would have been more familiar to an expectant Jewish group of disciples, is revealed more gradually and doesn't adhere as closely to that all or nothing pattern. Yeah. So at the end, I should have been saying he's revealed as Son of God on the cross, not as Messiah. Yeah.
Although, again, you go back to what's buried in, well, not buried, but revealed in the Isaiah books, the Southern Servant books. And I think all of the gospel writers make quite a lot of that, because for them, that confirms that this is actually the anointed. This is my anointed who dies.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks.
I have a memory from your Sunday school teacher, who's me around, so be careful. The none of it, don't know, that Mark might have inserted that to excuse the stupidness of his fellow Jewish folks. Because so many of those things are, you don't want to rush up to natural human instinct.
Yeah.
They didn't. Mark put that in to explain perhaps why they were.
So there's another theme that runs throughout Mark's Gospel that we normally call the polemic against the disciples. So the disciples are consistently presented with clear evidence of Jesus being someone who is extraordinary and special, and they consistently have no clue. They appear foolish. So if you wanted to engage in that kind of medieval form of theology of, well, how do we make that all come coherently, nicely together, then you might say something like what you offered, that this is Mark being kind of trying to be nice to a Jewish community to not kind of upset them too much, and something like that. The polemic against the disciples now is more commonly conceived of in terms of that opening statement in which we're told who he is, and as a kind of rhetorical device to slam it home to the reader, where they're kind of infuriating, getting more and more furious. Oh my goodness, have you not worked it out yet? Almost as if you're watching a whodunit and you've seen it at the start, and there's all these people, shaking hands with the butler and telling him what a good job he's doing, and you're thinking like, have you not noticed that you've got blood all over your hand when you've just shaken hands with him, or like, can you not see the knife in his pocket, and the rhetorical idea is that the more and more cross you get with them for being stupid, the more and more you're drawn into thinking, well, if I'd been in their shoes, I would have realised by now. Obviously, it's so that's the answer that gives Mark quite a lot of credibility as a good writer. That he was just trying to kind of be nice to people. Maybe. All wrapped up? Super. We have one more lecture next week by our resident rector. He will be speaking on the Passion narrative in St. Mark's Gospel and something about the end of it. And maybe something about the end of it. You'll have to come along to find out, as they say. Have a safe journey home this evening, a peaceful night and a perfect end, and continue your Lenten fasting, praying and reading of scriptures, and I'll see you next week.